Hey guys, tonight we're settling in with something soft, cozy, and only mildly chaotic. So if you haven't already, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe hold a cup of something warm, or at least pretend you're holding one like a Victorian child pretending they weren't freezing indoors. Whatever works for the sleepy vibe. Because tonight, we're floating gently into the world of Victorian Christmas, a world of flickering candles, questionable holiday traditions, and an entire society trying very, very hard to pretend winter wasn't absolutely miserable. So just relax, breathe, and let yourself drift while we explore what Christmas looked like back when people thought a bowl of flaming alcohol was the ideal centerpiece for a quiet family evening. Of course they did. Let's ease into it. Christmas in the Victorian era wasn't exactly the polished, cinnamon-scented holiday montage we know today. No Instagram-ready mantelpieces, no carefully curated, cozy aesthetic, and absolutely zero concept of matching pajamas. Although, to be fair, pajamas themselves were basically optional back then. People wore so many layers during the day that removing them at night was like dismantling a small tent. But the Victorians did reinvent Christmas. They're responsible for a good portion of the traditions we now consider classic. Gift-giving, Christmas cards, Christmas trees, massive roast dinners, and the general belief that December is supposed to be some kind of cheerful, heartwarming, emotional event, instead of what it naturally wants to be, a cold, dark month where everything looks like a Dickens novel. Speaking of Dickens, yes, he's coming. We'll get to him, but gently. You're trying to sleep, after all. No sudden appearance of chain-rattling ghosts tonight. Just a slow glide through the social mess that created Victorian Christmas. Let's start by drifting back to Britain in the early 1800s, before the Victorians had fully whipped Christmas into shape. Back then, Christmas was kind of nothing. A mild feast day, a reason to eat slightly nicer food, and then go right back to working 14-hour days at the textile factory. The Industrial Revolution wasn't exactly known for giving people time off. Christmas was not the centerpiece of the year. It was more like an inconvenient date the calendar insisted on, the way modern people treat National Sibling Day. But then Queen Victoria came along, with a level of domestic enthusiasm nobody had been prepared for. And more importantly, she brought Prince Albert, the man who looked at a pine tree and said essentially, yes, this belongs in the house. Albert was from Germany, where Christmas traditions were already thriving. Germans loved their trees. They loved their candles on trees, which feels questionable now, but was apparently perfectly normal then. They baked gingerbread shaped like things that were only vaguely festive. They had a whole vibe going, and Albert imported the vibe into Buckingham Palace with the determination of a man who had finally found something about Britain he could improve. And honestly, the Victorians ate it up. They saw that royal Christmas tree in an 1848 illustration, and suddenly every middle-class family was like, wow, I guess we need to drag a forest inside now. It became a whole seasonal personality. But we'll get there in a moment. Let's not rush. This is bedtime history, not the 19th century postal system. For now, just float with me into a typical Victorian December, where the weather was cold, the air was smoggy, and the streets smelled like a combination of roasting chestnuts, horse manure, and whatever chemical runoff the factories had decided to dump that week. Festive. Homes, especially working-class homes, were dim, cramped, and not exactly built with warmth in mind. Heating came from fireplaces, which were fine if you had fuel. Coal wasn't expensive, but it definitely wasn't free. And Christmas, in its developing Victorian form, was a holiday that wanted resources. But Victorians were determined to make it cozy, or at least look cozy. Actual comfort remained deeply optional. Let's ease into our first real scene. An early Victorian family preparing for Christmas before all the big reforms settled in. Imagine a mother trying to sweep soot out of a room that is, technically, made of soot. A father who's worn the same coat for 10 years because that's just how coats worked then. Children who were thrilled if they received an orange as a present because fruit hadn't yet become the thing you buy at 11 p.m. when you remembered you forgot snacks. This was Christmas when the idea of tradition was still forming, and Victorians were picking and choosing customs like they were assembling a holiday personality board. But let's slow down and look at the building blocks. Victorian decorations, the kind that would horrify modern fire marshals. Decorating was different. There were no plastic ornaments, no tinsel, unless you count long metal shavings, which, let's not. No LED lights. Victorians decorated with whatever was growing outside, which in winter was mostly evergreen branches and a sort of seasonal optimism. They draped holly and ivy everywhere, creating what can only be described as mildly festive forest chaos. The greenery was charming for about 3 days. Then it dried out, dropped needles everywhere, and became a highly flammable display of holiday spirit. And then, of course, there were candles. Because what's more logical than putting fire next to dead branches in a wooden home? Some people clipped candles directly onto their Christmas trees, others wedged them in with melted wax, a few placed them in holders that were supposed to catch wax strips, but mostly just gave a false sense of security. Fires were frequent, but apparently manageable enough for people to keep doing it every year, because Victorians loved the aesthetic commitment. Now, we have to glide gently over to the next layer of the holiday cake, the food. Victorian Christmas dinner was the moment people emotionally prepared for months in advance. Not because they were excited, but because they needed time to save up enough money to not serve disappointment as the main course. The menu usually included roast goose for working-class families, roast beef for those with middle-class ambitions, turkey for families who really wanted to show off, and plum pudding for absolutely everyone, because that thing was basically mandatory. Plum pudding, by the way, contained 0 plums, because of course it didn't. Early versions did, centuries before, but Victorians inherited the name long after the plums had packed their bags and left. Instead, the pudding was a dense, sweet, spiced, steamed mass of dried fruit, sweat, flour, and optimism. It took hours to cook and could potentially double as a medieval projectile. The Victorians loved it, and they especially loved setting it on fire, which fit nicely with their overall theme of, if it flickers or burns, put it on the Christmas table. But let's drift a little further, toward the thing Victorian Christmas is arguably most famous for, tradition building. The Victorians didn't just participate in Christmas, they practically reinvented it like the world's most determined rebrand. A lot of this came from writers, especially one man with a fondness for sentimental morality and emotionally exhausted protagonists, Charles Dickens. Dickens, the man who accidentally made Christmas emotional. Now, I promised we'd get to Dickens, so here he is, wandering into the story with the energy of a man carrying generational trauma and a deadline. A Christmas Tree, published in 1843, shaped Victorian Christmas like few things ever had. It wasn't the first Christmas story, but it was the one that hit all the sentiment buttons. Charity, nostalgia, regret, family dinners that probably taste better in fiction, and ghosts whose life choices needed improvement. What's funny is that he wrote it partly because he needed money. The Victorian publishing industry was brutal, and Dickens had about 6 different financial fires burning at once, similar to the average Victorian Christmas tree. But despite the financial motives, the story worked. People bought it,
People cried over it. People decided Christmas should be about kindness, giving, gentle self-reflection, and spending time with loved ones while desperately ignoring the economic realities of 19th century Britain. Progress. Dickens didn't just shape Christmas, he branded it. And Victorians, being middle-class social climbers at heart, embraced it like it was the latest smartphone. But before we drift further, let's float over to the more personal side of things, the homes, the people, and the slightly awkward family dynamics that made Victorian Christmas what it was. Family gatherings, awkward, crowded, and very on brand for the 1800s. Victorian families were large, very large. Children were practically a seasonal crop.
We're drifting deeper, softly, slowly, into the layers of Victorian Christmas. Nothing loud, nothing rushed. Just a calm float through history, like a quiet carriage rolling down a snowy cobblestone street, the kind where the horse is also tired and kind of over it. In Part 1, we hung out with Dickens, burning puddings, and the general invention of Christmas as feelings. Now, we slip further into the social structure, because Victorian society loved structure. They loved hierarchies. They loved labeling people. They loved knowing exactly who was above them and who was below them, usually by checking coat fabric or the number of spoons someone owned. And Christmas reflected that, beautifully, quietly, and sometimes awkwardly. Let's drift into the upper class first. The people with the big houses, the big fireplaces, and the kind of decorative ambitions that could only come from having servants who actually had to execute those ambitions. Upper class Christmas, the season of being extremely comfortably festive. If you were wealthy in Victorian England, Christmas was nice, almost suspiciously nice, like, are you sure this is the same century nice? Imagine a country estate, long driveway, trees dusted with frost, a house so large that half of it exists purely to confuse guests. Inside, fires crackling in fireplaces that were actually designed well. They didn't belch smoke into the room like working-class fireplaces did. Carpets were thick, furniture was polished, everything smelled faintly of beeswax, pipe smoke, and whatever seasonal greens the servants were wrestling into garlands that were longer than most Victorian streets. In these homes, decorating wasn't a quick afternoon activity. It was an operation. Servants went out days in advance to cut boughs of holly and laurel and ivy that carried them by the wagon load. The house was adorned like a festival forest, though with a budget that could support significantly fewer fire hazards. Candles were still everywhere, of course, because Victorians just couldn't stop themselves, but wealthier households had more space, taller ceilings, and slightly fewer things placed directly under the candles. Christmas for the rich revolved around several key activities. 1. Displays of abundant food. Think of the Christmas table like a Victorian flex. You had roast turkey and roast beef, goose for symbolism, salmon if you wanted to remind people you had connections, pies, puddings, trifles, and fruit that cost half a week's wages for the average person, a massive bowl of wassail or punch that could ferment a small village. These dinners went on for hours. Not exciting hours, just long hours. Courses drifted out in a sequence that felt less like nourishment and more like a polite endurance test. And for the rich, giving leftovers to the poor afterwards wasn't just kindness, it was expected. Victorian nobles loved the optics of charity. They loved it so much that sometimes they gave food away as a public event, like a ceremonial distribution of Christmas beef. It wasn't always warm or even good, but it was a gesture. And Victorians adored gestures. 2. Lavish gift exchanges. Unlike the working class, wealthy Victorians were fully on board with gifting. They bought jewelry, fancy stationery, silver trinkets, books with those gold-embossed covers that were heavy enough to cause wrist injuries, embroidered slippers nobody actually asked for,
And they also exchanged things like decorative fans, handcrafted boxes, and, my favorite, items that were technically practical but clearly meant to sit untouched in a drawer for the next decade. But family politics existed too. A bad gift was a statement. A very small gift might symbolize tension. A too large gift might symbolize guilt. And nobody wanted to be the relative who accidentally gave something nicer than what they received, because then you look tacky. It was all extremely Victorian. 3. House parties that lasted forever. Christmas house parties could last weeks. People arrived by train, by carriage, by whatever means allowed them to bring enough luggage to survive ratio-based judging. Once inside, they fell into a schedule of dinners, quiet music, parlor games, excessive social politeness, and long conversations in front of fires where everyone pretended to enjoy each other's company. The drama was quiet but omnipresent. Someone always disliked someone else. Someone always had an opinion about someone's unmarried daughter. Someone always thought the pudding was underspiced. And someone always got too emotional about a carol. This was peak Victorian seasonal atmosphere. But let's drift away from the cozy wealth now, because it's time, softly, gently, to step into a very different kind of Christmas. Working class Christmas. A little nicer than usual, but not by much. This is the part of Victorian life the polished illustrations rarely show. And honestly, it's more interesting. Most Victorians weren't wealthy. They weren't middle class either. They were laborers, factory workers, domestic servants, dock hands, miners, seamstresses, people whose lives were defined by wages, hours, and housing conditions you would politely describe as structurally questionable. To them, Christmas was a brief pause, a momentary softening of an otherwise unyielding year. Working-class homes were small, 1 or 2 rooms for an entire family, sometimes more family members than chairs, sometimes more children than beds. Fireplaces existed, but heating was minimal. Everyone wore layers because clothing was their insulation. Decorations were simple. A bit of holly, maybe some ivy, paper chains made from old newspaper. 1 candle if you had one to spare. And yes, they still put up trees. Small ones, muted ones. Trees that looked like they were doing their best, much like the families themselves. But the real heart of working-class Christmas was food. People saved money for weeks, sometimes months. Half a penny here, a penny there. Enough for a goose, or part of a goose, or a goose that looked like it had lived a long and difficult life. Enough for potatoes, greens, gravy, and, if things went well, a homemade pudding that steamed for hours in a pot suspended by string. The dinner wasn't luxurious, but it was better. And better was meaningful. Children sometimes received a small toy, a wooden top, a rag doll, or a book if the parents were ambitious. More often, gifts were edible. An apple, a handful of nuts, a sweet, something consumable because consumables didn't take up space in a home where space wasn't really a thing. And then there were workers whose Christmas didn't happen on Christmas Day at all because they were servants. Servants' Christmas, the holiday you celebrated when the household allowed it. Most middle and upper class families employed servants. Servants cooked the food. Servants decorated the house. Servants tended the fires. Servants wrapped gifts and cleaned up after the holiday festivities ended. Christmas Day was, ironically, one of the busiest days of the year for them. While the family relaxed by the fire, servants worked in overheated kitchens, managed endless dishes, and orchestrated the entire feast like a behind-the-scenes theatrical miracle. Their Christmas usually happened 1 day later. Boxing Day. And no, Boxing Day was not Victorian Fight Club. It referred to the opening of charity boxes given by employers, small monetary gifts, leftover food, maybe some clothing. The servants finally got a day to themselves, a day to visit family if they could afford the transportation, a day to breathe. It wasn't luxurious, but it mattered. Victorian charity, however symbolic, did lighten the season for many, and the concept of giving to those who served you became part of the broader social fabric. But then we glide into another layer, a softer, more sentimental one. Christmas cards, the Victorian version of, "I hope you're doing well, but from a distance." Christmas cards are one of the most Victorian inventions ever. Pretty, socially required, mildly passive-aggressive if you sent one to someone you disliked. The first commercial Christmas card was printed in 1843 by Henry Cole, yes, the same year Dickens released A Christmas Carol. Apparently that year was the Black Friday of historical Christmas innovation. The first card depicted a family toasting wine, flanked by images of charity. It was very wholesome, very symbolic, very Victorian. Cards became popular fast. People mailed them everywhere. And the post office, suddenly realizing it had stumbled into a seasonal gold mine, leaned all the way in. Victorian cards were interesting. Some had flowers, some had winter scenes, some had children doing vaguely concerning things like riding oversized birds. There were even cards featuring dead robins, frogs in top hats, and anthropomorphic vegetables. Victorians just had a strange sense of festive. But cards mattered. They connected people across distances in a world where travel was expensive. They let the lonely feel.
We're slipping now into late Victorian Christmas, the era when Christmas was no longer just a holiday, but a full lifestyle choice. By the 1880s and 1890s, Britain had committed. They'd built momentum. The decorations were bigger, the gifts were fancier, the marketing was bolder, and the general vibe had fully transitioned from charming emerging tradition to this is now a cultural juggernaut, please participate. So, just float with me as we follow the holiday into its next stage. The Victorian Christmas tree, now with even more questionable lighting choices. By the late 19th century, the Christmas tree had gone from foreign prince's quirky import to absolutely mandatory household centerpiece. Victorians loved trees. They loved them almost too much. Families competed, quietly, politely, but still very competitively, over whose tree was the most charming, the most tasteful, or the most densely decorated. Let's imagine one of those trees. It's much smaller than today's mammoth supermarket trees, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. People didn't have high ceilings unless they were wealthy, and even then they wanted the tree to sit on a table because elevation made it feel important. The decorations were creative. Strings of popcorn, yes, really. Dried oranges, which made the room smell like someone who bathed irregularly but tried their best. Paper ornaments, hand-cut by children whose motor skills were still developing. Sweets wrapped in coloured paper, which slowly melted because rooms were slightly too warm near the fire. Tin and glass baubles, often imported from Germany and fragile enough to break if you breathed too enthusiastically near them. And, of course, candles. By the late Victorian period, candle holders had improved slightly, but the risk remained. Families lit candles for about 10 minutes at a time, supervised them intensely, and then blew them out before the tree turned into a matchstick. It was festive, but also a bit like participating in a seasonal fire drill. Still, to Victorians, the tree's glow, warm, flickering, fleeting, felt magical. Something soft, something sentimental, something that made the industrial, grimy world outside feel far away. The rise of the modern Christmas gift industry. Capitalism arrives in a sleigh. By the 1880s, shops realized Christmas was a recurring event, and more importantly, they realized Christmas made people emotional enough to spend money they didn't technically have. Department stores were on the rise.
Cities like London, Manchester and Birmingham filled with bright, sometimes overly enthusiastic shop windows. Displays included dolls, books, tin toys, small mechanical gadgets, and everything a Victorian child could want, except, adequate health care. Middle-class families now embraced gifts as a full holiday ritual. Not extravagant, just a few items each, but commercial enough that newspapers ran holiday advertisements, shopkeepers stayed open late, and toy makers experienced their annual busy season meltdown. Victorian parents, entirely susceptible to guilt and seasonal sentiment, bought dolls with disturbingly fixed expressions, tin soldiers, wooden rocking horses, little wind-up toys that made repetitive clicking sounds, and books filled with moral lessons about humility, which were often gifted alongside far too expensive trinkets. The contradictions of Victorian morality remained charmingly consistent. For adults, gifting became both easier and harder. Easier because stores now stocked gift items, harder because expectations were rising. A gentleman couldn't give his wife a simple comb anymore. He had to give at least a decorative comb, preferably one with silver inlay, perhaps engraved, maybe with a small gemstone. Ideally, something impressively impractical. Victorians excelled at impracticality. Christmas crackers, explosive paper tubes filled with micro-disappointment. Now let's glide toward one of the most iconic Victorian inventions, the Christmas cracker. Tom Smith, a London confectioner, came up with the idea in the 1840s. Originally, he sold sweets wrapped in decorative paper, but consumers were like, cute, but can it make noise? So, naturally, he added a small gunpowder-coated strip that snapped when pulled apart, because why wouldn't you add mild explosives to a family holiday? By the late 19th century, crackers were everywhere. Inside, you found a paper crown that made everyone look like a weary medieval monarch, a small gift, usually useless like a thimble or a tiny wrench no one knew what to do with, and a joke, deeply unfunny, which made them perfect for Victorian gatherings. Crackers were the great equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone eventually ended up wearing a flimsy paper crown that slipped over one eye. A democratic tradition. Victorian schools and Christmas. Seasonal morale boosting for children who worked too hard. Schools participated too, not enthusiastically. Victorian teachers were basically stern wizards of discipline, but they tried. Leading up to the holiday, schools had little concerts, recitations of poems no child liked, small gift distributions, and occasional parties that were considered extremely fun if you compared them to normal Victorian school days. But keep in mind, many children didn't attend school regularly. Some worked and attended part-time, some barely saw the inside of a classroom. Still, Christmas meant a day off. Maybe two if the headmaster was feeling generous, and free oranges or nuts from charitable groups. There were children who remembered Christmas at school as the one time adults acted mildly human. Winter charity. Victorian compassion, but make it seasonal and socially polished. We have to drift gently through the moral landscape of Victorian charity, because Christmas brought out a very particular form of generosity. Victorians loved charity. They loved being seen doing charity. They loved writing about charity in newspapers. They loved forming committees about charity and then forming subcommittees to discuss whether the committees were charitable enough. Christmas amplified all of this. We see coal distributions, food baskets, winter clothing drives, orphanage visits, church charity events, and rich families hosting poor children's dinners. These dinners were a mix of genuine kindness and theatrical philanthropy. Children from impoverished neighborhoods were invited to eat modest meals, sometimes sing a carol, and then leave with a small gift. Photographers occasionally showed up to capture the festive goodwill, and the event would be mentioned in the local paper with everyone's full names spelled out carefully. Victorian charity was helpful, but it also functioned as a social currency. Still, for families struggling through harsh winters, it meant real warmth, real food, and a rare moment of comfort. Christmas and the industrial work schedule. A brief and glorious pause. Now let's drift onto the factory floor. Not literally, that would be loud and the opposite of sleepy, but mentally. Industrial workers often worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Christmas Day was one of the few guaranteed days off. Box-making factories, textile mills, foundries, mines, everyone stopped. Not entirely out of kindness, more because the church calendar still had cultural weight. The day after Christmas, though, back to work. Unless your employer was wildly generous and gave a second day off, in which case you probably assumed the world was ending. Feast preparations. Kitchens became the center of the universe. In middle-class and upper-class homes, the kitchen staff worked tirelessly through December. Christmas dinner required roasting, boiling, baking, steaming, more boiling, and occasionally lighting things on fire intentionally. Kitchen servants lived in a constant state of heat exhaustion and mild panic. But they also took pride in the feast. Christmas was the culinary Olympics. And if you were a guest, you had no idea the kitchen was running on adrenaline and sheer willpower. You just saw a glossy roast, perfectly browned potatoes, gravies thick enough to defy physics, and puddings studded with enough fruit to double as currency. Victorians didn't have minimalism, they had maximalism. And nowhere was that clearer than the table. Christmas Eve traditions. The calm before the calm. It wasn't a chaotic explosion of wrapping paper. It wasn't a competition over who got the most gifts. It was slow, gentle, sometimes almost ceremonial. Families gathered. Children read stories. Fires burned low. Carols drifted softly if someone felt brave enough to sing. Some families attended church services. Others stayed home and prepared small surprises for the next day. Many simply sat together, a precious rarity in an era where daily life pulled everyone in different directions.
We're floating deeper into the Victorian holiday season now, past the food, past the presents, past the goose that probably upset someone's stomach, and into the gentle, simmering world of Christmas family dynamics, which, in the Victorian era, were very much a sport. Because nothing's as merry and bright quite like a tightly corseted room full of people quietly resenting one another while nibbling fruitcake. And yet all of this was considered normal, comforting even, a tradition, just like overboiled vegetables and slightly passive-aggressive Christmas cards today. So let's drift back into 19th century parlors where the air was thick with coal smoke, candle wax, and that very specific perfume of people who bathed occasionally. Sliding into the Victorian Christmas evening. As dusk rolled in, which, let's be honest, in Victorian England meant roughly 3:45 p.m., the Christmas festivities slowly shifted from the day's activities into the night's quieter rituals. Think gentle card games. Think out-of-tune carols. Think everyone pretending they weren't absolutely exhausted from waking up at dawn because the children demanded to open presents the moment the sun considers rising. The Victorians genuinely believed evenings were the most wholesome part of Christmas Day. This is partly because it was the one time of day when a well-off father wasn't working, commuting through mud, arguing about parliamentary reform, or trying not to slip on a poorly lit London street and break every bone in his body. But even in this cozy atmosphere, Christmas wasn't exactly peaceful. Victorian families brought their own brand of gentle chaos.
the kind where everyone is smiling, but someone is 15 minutes away from tears for reasons they won't disclose until March. Let's ease into it. The art of forced merriment. Victorian households believed a well-composed Christmas evening should look like something out of an illustrated magazine, calm, picturesque, slightly stiff, and extremely respectable. But behind the scenes, someone was absolutely having a minor meltdown about the pudding consistency. Someone else was drinking a little too much punch because the season demands it. Two cousins were probably fighting over who cheated at Snapdragon, and the family matriarch, wrapped tightly in layers of silk, lace, and judgment, was trying desperately to keep everyone's behavior within the accepted boundaries of Victorian decency. And of course, at least one adolescent was sulking in a hallway about a present that wasn't the right kind of present. Because even 140 years ago, teenagers were teenagers. But on the outside, everything looked perfectly serene. That's the Victorian magic. Parlour games, the calm, sleepy agents of absolute chaos. Victorians adored parlour games, especially after dinner, when they needed low-energy activities that wouldn't require any actual physical skills, emotional stability, or ability to sing on key. Some favorites. Blind man's buff. Someone was blindfolded, everyone else walked slowly around them. The blindfolded person tried to catch someone, people giggled quietly, someone pretended not to be offended when they were identified by touch. It was essentially the Victorian version of group therapy, except no one learned anything. Charades, but make it Victorians. Deeply serious, slow-paced, slightly pompous acting of things like a telegraph operator, the British Empire, a cow, all delivered with theatrical flair and the world's most repressed emotional intensity. The Minister's Cat, a calm alphabet game that devolved into quiet competition about who could think of more adjectives, because nothing says Christmas like subtle intellectual combat. A quiet word about punch. Victorian punch, Christmas punch especially, was strong enough to knock out half the cast of A Christmas Carol in one serving. Picture this: a bowl, a ladle, and enough alcohol that the punch alone probably had voting rights. The punch was warming, festive, and very useful for making awkward family evenings feel slightly less awkward. People claimed it lifted the spirits, which, yes, quite literally. It also made a few uncles sing carols louder than anyone wanted. But families tolerated it because it was tradition. And Victorians loved tradition more than they loved personal comfort. Carols sung softly and slightly off-key. Victorian carol singing wasn't the energetic, modern, let's harmonize like a choir version. It was slower, sleepier, gentle, like everyone was trying not to disturb the furniture. Families gathered around a small piano, usually played by the one person who took lessons long enough to be considered not entirely hopeless, and sang classics like God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, The First Noel, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, all at a tempo that suggested they were winding down after a long winter's nap. Even the cheerful songs had this quiet melancholy to them because Victorians absolutely excelled at being festive and mildly depressed at the same time. The Christmas tree, now gently illuminated. By the evening, the Christmas tree was the glowing centerpiece of the parlor. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had popularized it, and by the 1850s it became essential for proper middle-class holiday respectability. But remember, Victorian Christmas trees had real candles, little open flames placed lovingly on branches of a highly flammable tree, inside a house built of wood, filled with fabrics that definitely didn't pass any fire safety standards. So while the tree was beautiful, It also radiated the energy of one careless sneeze and the entire household is toast. To maintain the illusion of tranquility, someone always kept a bucket of water nearby. Just casually, not suspicious at all. And that gentle tension added a certain Victorian flavor. The quiet decline into post-dinner torpor. By now, the punch had settled, the games had been played, the carols were done, and everyone was drifting into that soft, sleepy state where conversation slows down and eyelids get heavy. Children were usually shepherded off to bed, sometimes with a story, sometimes with a gentle reminder that Santa was watching all year long, which was Victorian for "please sleep so we can finally sit down." Meanwhile, adults loosened their collars, unbuttoned their gloves, yes, indoor gloves were a thing, and let themselves relax in a way Victorian society usually didn't permit. Coal was added to the fire, candles flickered, someone inevitably fell asleep in a chair and refused to admit it. Very Victorian. Approaching the final act of the Victorian Christmas day. By the late hours, still early by modern standards, but late for people accustomed to gaslight, the holiday atmosphere grew even quieter.
We're sliding into the quieter, stranger corners of the Victorian holiday season now. The parts that don't get featured on greeting cards because they're, well, slightly odd. Because for Victorians, Christmas wasn't just about trees, pudding, or pretending the goose wasn't dry. It was also a season filled with superstitions, omens, ghost stories, and a surprising amount of "let's hope the spirits don't mess with us tonight." They carried this gentle belief that December was a thin place, a kind of calm, dark threshold where the living world drifted close enough to the other side that you could almost wave hello, or at least politely nod. So let's float into that space, the softer, weirder undercurrent of Victorian Christmas tradition, sliding quietly into Victorian Christmas superstitions. Victorians adored superstitions. They collected them the way we collect unused apps, without thinking too hard about it and never deleting them. Christmas was no exception. And because Victorians loved order and low-level anxiety, they turned the holiday season into a neat little calendar of omens. Nothing dramatic, just gentle, cozy worries like if the first visitor on Christmas morning was a man. Good luck for the household. Extra good luck if he was tall, dark-haired, and not a relative. Basically, a Victorian woman's fantasy novel protagonist arriving right on time. If the first visitor was a woman, well, bad luck. Because of course it was. The patriarchy never takes holidays off. If a candle guttered or went out suddenly, a spirit was passing through, hopefully just browsing. If you dropped a piece of Christmas greenery, someone in the house would fall ill. Or you just had bad aim, but Victorians preferred the ominous version. If the Yule log didn't burn properly, a forecast of misfortune. Though really it just meant someone bought cheap firewood again. These superstitions weren't taken very seriously, more like background noise. A soft Victorian hum of, "Oh, that's a bad omen." Anyway, past the pudding. Ghost stories, the sleepy, spooky Victorian Christmas tradition. Now let's float gently into my favorite part, Victorian Christmas ghost stories. Yes, Christmas was the Victorian Halloween. It was their cozy, candle-lit season of mild supernatural discomfort. Not because they wanted to be scared, but because long, dark winter nights practically begged for a little storytelling, and because Victorians were already living in a world where death was extremely present. High mortality, disease, accidents, the general hazards of existing near a horse. Ghost stories became a way to process all that, quietly. Nothing too terrifying, nothing loud, often moralistic, usually comforting in a strange, melancholy way. Think ghosts that murmured advice, spirits who wanted closure, mild hauntings from people who really just needed someone to hear their feelings. Even A Christmas Carol is basically ghost-led emotional therapy with a sprinkle of seasonal redemption. Families would sit near the fire after the games were finished, the punch slightly settling, the candles flickering, and someone would begin. Something curious happened one Christmas Eve. And the room would hush. Not in fear, just in that shared, sleepy anticipation, a communal drifting. Victorian ghost stories weren't designed to startle you. They were designed to make you stare at the fire and quietly contemplate your life choices. Honestly, kind of therapeutic. Telling stories by firelight, a very Victorian pastime. Picture it, a dim room, the only light coming from a few candles, the fireplace, and possibly a slightly smoldering Christmas tree that someone needed to check on. Someone settles into a padded armchair, probably the most dramatic relative, and begins telling a story in a low, steady voice. Something about a ghostly carriage, or a mysterious figure seen on a frosty lane, or an ancestor who keeps knocking politely at the door every December 24th. Meanwhile, half the room slowly dozes off, which was considered totally acceptable. Christmas ghost stories were basically an early form of guided sleep podcasts. Victorians would have absolutely thrived in the ASMR era. A gentle drift into Boxing Day. Now let's move softly into the next part of the Victorian holiday season, Boxing Day. The name sounds like it should involve punching, but being Victorian, it involved absolutely no sudden movements. Boxing Day fell on December 26th, and it was traditionally a day dedicated to servants, workers, tradespeople, and anyone employed by the household in any capacity. The boxes were literal, small wooden or cardboard containers filled with food, gifts, money, leftover goose bits no one wanted, or re-gifted items the family didn't need. It was the Victorian version of "thank you for dealing with this family all year." But Boxing Day wasn't just for generosity. It was also for status performance. Because in Victorian society, the appearance of moral virtue counted almost as much as actually being virtuous. Families made sure their acts of giving were noticed, not flaunted, just gently visible. A subtle, yes, we donated to the poor. Of course we did. We're respectable. The holiday spirit, Victorian style. The servant reality, Christmas below stairs. Of course, while the upper classes floated around worrying about pudding consistency and candle drafts, the servants were, well, doing everything. Like literally everything. Christmas below stairs was high pressure, exhausting, and probably smelled like boiling potatoes for 10 consecutive hours. Maids began before dawn, Cooks worked non-stop. Footmen carried more trays than a small army. Housekeepers kept the whole operation from collapsing entirely. And Boxing Day? For them, it was the first breath of fresh air after weeks of preparation. They might visit family, or attend a simple meal, or just sleep for 12 hours straight, which feels very relatable. Victorian Christmas was lovely if you were upstairs. It was survivable if you were downstairs. And quietly. Now let's drift into point.
We're leaving Christmas behind now, gently, without fanfare, and gliding toward the Victorian version of the New Year, which, unsurprisingly, was quieter, more sentimental, and slightly more superstitious than ours. There were no fireworks, no glitter, no midnight parties with 10 types of appetizers. Victorians simply didn't have the energy for that level of enthusiasm. They preferred their holidays the way they preferred their architecture: dignified, mildly gloomy, and structurally sound. So let's drift into the slow, reflective mood that hung over Britain after Christmas. Coal fires burning low, decorations starting to wilt, everyone waiting for January like it's some mystical, slightly disappointing reboot of reality. New Year's Eve, Victorian style, calm, cold, and surprisingly sentimental. Victorian New Year's Eve wasn't a festival. It was a gentle, candlelit check-in with oneself, the 19th century equivalent of sitting silently with a cup of tea and staring at the wall. Most families spent the evening indoors. Fires crackled, someone read aloud, someone else pretended not to fall asleep in their chair, and people often journaled. Because Victorians loved journaling more than oxygen. It was practically a national pastime. New Year's Eve entries often looked like, "Another year gone, reflections made, pray for better fortune," which is Victorian for, "Well, that happened." They didn't do midnight countdowns either. Most people went to bed at a normal time and let the new year just show up. Quietly, politely, like a distant relative who arrives without knocking but at least wipes their feet. A soft note on Victorian resolutions. Victorian resolutions weren't, "I'll go to the gym," or "I'll learn Spanish." They were more like, "I shall endeavor to improve my temper. I resolve to avoid idleness. I vow to write more letters and complain less about the weather." Their resolutions were charmingly self-critical, very moral, very guilt-based. Exactly what you'd expect from a culture where being too joyful was considered suspicious. People didn't announce their resolutions publicly either. They tucked them into diaries or kept them quietly in mind. No accountability partners, no motivational posters, just pure, uncut Victorian self-judgment. First footing, the calm tradition of waiting for a stranger to fix your year. Victorian New Year's tradition was called first footing, the belief that the first person to walk through your door on January 1st determined your luck for the entire year. It was originally Scottish, but Victorians loved adopting any tradition that offered the opportunity for mild social anxiety. The ideal first foot was tall, dark-haired, and male, because apparently that combination was considered a good omen for prosperity, fertility, and basic house vibes. A fair-haired visitor? Bad luck. A woman?
Also bad luck. A clumsy neighbor who dropped something on the doorstep? Disastrous. The chosen first footer was often arranged in advance because Victorians didn't like leaving anything to chance. They would strategically deploy the tallest dark-haired male acquaintance at precisely midnight to knock politely on the door, step inside, and present symbolic good luck items like bread, coal, salt, or a coin. Basically, a very low-energy Santa Claus, but specifically for January 1st. Once the symbolic items were placed indoors, he would sit awkwardly for a moment while the family tried to act natural. Then he'd leave, probably relieved that his annual duties were complete. The slow removal of Christmas greenery, a carefully timed ritual. Victorians believed that greenery, holly, ivy, mistletoe, acted like a seasonal energy field. Not in a magical or cheerful sense, but in a, if you don't remove this on the correct day, the spirits will be offended kind of way. The acceptable takedown window was January 5th, or in some places, January 6th. Absolutely not earlier, absolutely not later. Removing greenery too soon was unlucky. Leaving it up too long was also unlucky. Victorians were committed to the idea that destiny was deeply invested in their interior decorating schedule. So Holst houses slowly peeled away the fading decorations, dry, brittle berries dropping on the floor, leaves curling in on themselves, and carefully carried them outside. But they didn't throw them away. They burned them. Yes, Victorians believed tossing greenery into the fire sealed away any lingering spirits that might have been visiting during the festive season. It was less goodbye Christmas and more thank you for not haunting us, please exit safely. The return of ordinary life, steam, fog, and quiet streets. By the first week of January, the Victorian world snapped back to its usual winter rhythm. Children returned to school, factories resumed their endless churning, servants returned to their regular routines, and the streets refilled with the usual mix of noise, horse manure, and fog. Shops reopened. Parliament reconvened. People went back to wearing the same slightly depressed expressions they wore every other month. Victorian diaries often include lines like, "Christmas has passed. Return to my work with gratitude." Which, given the working conditions of the era, is, optimistic. But they truly believed that emerging from the holiday haze and stepping back into responsibility was practical, necessary, and almost comforting in its routine. You survived the festivities. You navigated family politics. You didn't burn down the house with the Christmas tree. Now, back to life.
We're slipping now into the slower, quieter stretch of Victorian winter, the weeks that follow the fading glow of Christmas and the polite sigh of New Year's Day. This is the part of the year where time moves slowly, very slowly, like fog rolling over cobblestones in London, or snow settling silently in the Yorkshire countryside. And of course, the Victorians felt it acutely. The gentle weight of post-holiday melancholy. By late January, many Victorians found themselves drifting in a mild post-holiday melancholy. The candles were gone, the Christmas trees burned or discarded,
The feasts were memories. Even the punch was finished. Daily life returned. Coal dust, factories, long hours in schoolwork, and the contrast made everything feel slightly more somber. Middle and upper-class diaries often include lines like, "The gaiety of December is but a memory. The long nights weigh heavy. The fire burns low, and one reflects on fleeting joys." And yes, it's exactly as sleepy and soft as it sounds. Victorians were masters of gentle self-reflection and unhurried gloom. For children, the melancholy was cushioned by winter play, snow if there was any, indoor games, storytelling, but for adults, it was more introspective, slower. Streets and weather, fog, frost, and gentle isolation. Victorian cities were foggy. Fogs weren't just atmospheric, they were omnipresent. Coal smoke mingled with the cold air to create the infamous London pea souper. Walking outside was slow. Conversations muffled, horse-drawn carriages clopped softly through misty streets. It felt like the world was moving in slow motion. Perfect for reflection. Slightly nerve-wracking if you were heading to work. Frost settled on windows, turning interiors into cozy havens. Houses glowed with firelight. Tea warmed hands, and everyone who could afford it layered up in shawls, gloves, and heavy coats. Winter for the poor was harsher, of course. Homes were small, heating was minimal, food stretched to last. But for everyone, the season demanded patience, endurance, and quiet perseverance. Quiet entertainment, reading, sewing, and gentle socializing. After the intensity of Christmas, Victorians craved calm. Evenings were filled with gentle, low-energy entertainment. Reading, moral tales, serialized novels or newspapers. Dickens's works were popular even post-Christmas because they carried a cozy moral resonance. Sewing and knitting, practical, meditative, and sometimes used to prepare gifts for spring or summer. Parlor conversation, soft, slow exchanges, usually about family news, local events, or minor political developments. Music, piano pieces, softly played. Songs from the holidays lingered, but often at a slower tempo. Everything was soft, measured, and deliberately paced. Even entertainment followed the rhythm of long winter nights. The memory of Christmas lingers. Though decorations were gone, the memory of Christmas lingered quietly. The glow of candlelight on trees, the faint scent of pudding and roast, the echoes of carols softly hummed, the small joys of presents, games, and stories. Victorians liked to linger in these memories, not as a form of escapism exactly, but as a reminder that life had periods of softness and light. It gave them endurance for the darker weeks ahead. For the wealthy, it meant reflecting on their families, social circles, and charitable acts. For the working class, it meant quietly savoring the warmth of what little had been shared. And for servants, it was a reminder that a brief respite had passed, but that survival and routine continued. The fading of decorations, gentle rituals, and symbolism. By late January, all greenery had been removed and ceremonially burned. This was not only practical, preventing mold or infestation, but symbolic. It marked the end of the festive period. It honored the spirits that had been present during Christmas, and it closed the holiday cycle with quiet reflection. Victorians found meaning in these rituals. Even the mundane acts of sweeping up pine needles, extinguishing candle remnants, were embedded with sentiment. Because to them, holidays were not just events. They were cycles, patterns, softly held experiences in time. Looking ahead, a pause before Lent. After the cozy lull of early January, Victorians began preparing for the next seasonal rhythms. Winter survival, keeping warm, stretching food stores, conserving coal. Moral reflection, reading and journaling, considering the lessons of the holiday. Social obligations, letters, small gatherings, and quiet neighborhood visits. It was still winter, still slow and still demanding, but also quiet, reflective, and, in a sense, restorative. The Victorians understood that the post-holiday period wasn't about excitement. It was about soft endurance, gentle memory, and maintaining the rhythm of domestic life. The subtle thread of continuity. In all of this, one thing was constant: the seasonal rhythm of the year. Christmas, New Year's, and the following weeks were like waves, softly rolling in, lingering, fading, leaving a trace. The lights, laughter, and warmth of the holiday persisted in memory, just enough to sustain spirits until spring. Even in the fog, the coal smoke, and the chill, the Victorians had their rituals, their quiet joys, and their comforting routines. It was slow, it was deliberate, and it was profoundly human. It's the perfect setting to explore the lingering effects of Christmas on Victorian life, how the holiday evolved, how eccentricities flourished, and how quiet customs persisted into the early 20th century. The evolution of Victorian Christmas into the modern era. By the end of the 1890s, Christmas had shifted significantly from its early Victorian roots. What began as a semi-obscure revival of medieval and imported traditions had transformed into a cultural institution with complete standardized trees, mass-produced decorations, commercialized gift-giving, and public celebrations in parks, shops, and churches. Victorians essentially invented modern Christmas as we know it today. If you've ever seen an elaborate department store window display, a decorative tree in a living room, or a Christmas card that looks slightly staged, you can thank them. The holiday became both sentimental and socially performative. It was a way to signal virtue, taste, and cultural literacy. Yet at its heart, it remained a domestic, cozy, candlelit experience, not the bombastic, neon-colored spectacle it can feel like today. Victorian family eccentricities, the heartbeat of Christmas. No Victorian Christmas was complete without a little domestic oddity. Families were quirky, hierarchic, and delightfully idiosyncratic. Consider a few recurring themes. The overzealous patriarch, proud of the tree, slightly tipsy from punch, and narrating stories no one remembers later. The artistic child, making paper decorations that inevitably fell apart before the 25th. The stern matriarch, checking pudding consistency and the color of the holly, mildly disappointed in everyone's lack of refinement. The eccentric cousin, bringing an unusual gift like a mechanical toy, a tiny animal figurine, or, in one recorded case, a jar of pickled walnuts. The devoted servant, ensuring everything runs perfectly while secretly hoping for a day off that never lasts long enough. These eccentricities gave every Victorian Christmas its unique personality. No two celebrations were exactly alike, yet all shared the same soft, measured rhythm. Letters, cards, and the rise of sentimentality. By the end of the 19th century, Christmas cards had become an essential tradition. They were sent in mass quantities, often with sentimental verses or moral messages. Families used them to maintain social connections, display taste, and subtly assert status. Children loved sending illustrated cards with hand-colored details, while adults enjoyed observing which acquaintances reciprocated. Cards were part of the ritualized domestic performance, a way of carrying the warmth of the season into the wider social sphere, even if just in a slow, polite, Victorian way. Early 20th century echoes. Victorian traditions persist. Although the Victorian era formally ended in 1901, many of its Christmas customs persist.
At this point in the night, things feel slower, softer, and just a little hazy. Perfect for drifting through the small, often overlooked quirks and minor disasters that made Victorian Christmases, well, quietly chaotic in their own unassuming way. We're talking about misunderstandings, miscommunications, awkward family dynamics, and the kind of problems that weren't dramatic enough to make headlines, but absolutely made it into diaries and letters. So let's gently unravel some of those threads. The tradition of accidental chaos. Victorian families did a lot to make Christmas perfect. And naturally, that meant things frequently went wrong. Not loudly wrong, just politely wrong. Let's glide through a few types of gentle disasters. The pudding that didn't behave. The Christmas pudding was the star of the show. It took days to prepare and hours to steam, and involved an unreasonable amount of stirring. Naturally, this created endless opportunities for mishaps. Someone forgot the suet. Someone mistook salt for sugar. Tragically common. Someone oversteamed it until it resembled a dark, rubbery cannonball. Or someone added way too much brandy, turning it into a small, flammable hazard. One diary describes a pudding so dense it defied penetration by man or knife, which is possibly the most Victorian way anyone has ever said, "It was terrible." The Great Tree Debacles. Christmas trees were beautiful. They were also a logistical nightmare. Tree mishap number 1, the Leaning Tower of Pine. Victorians didn't always have proper stands, so trees were often propped in buckets filled with sand, pebbles, ash, or anything heavy enough to discourage gravity from expressing itself. The result? A shocking number of trees toppled over during dinner, almost always onto the child who was most excited that year. Tree mishap number 2, candle chaos. The dark side of candlelit branches was, well, the fire risk. Yes, they knew it was dangerous. And yes, they did it anyway. Because aesthetics have always been more important than common sense. Most fires were quickly extinguished, and the average Victorian letter narrates these incidents with unsettling calm, like, "The tree again smoldered. We removed the scorch marks before Mother noticed." Very chill, very Victorian, no urgency whatsoever. Victorian gift-giving, a study in miscommunication.
Gift-giving was both sentimental and awkward. Not everyone understood what constituted a nice present. The art of the unwanted gift. Common Victorian complaints included receiving a book you already owned, getting gloves in a color you despised, lumpy homemade socks from relatives who meant well, or mechanically questionable toys that broke before Boxing Day. And because Victorians were painfully polite, everyone just smiled through it. A popular etiquette guide even advised, accept every gift with gratitude, regardless of its utility or charm. Translation, prepare your fake smile and brace for impact. Parlor games. Quietly competitive chaos. Victorians loved gentle indoor activities. Parlor games were meant to be fun, but they were also a minefield for embarrassment, poorly concealed resentment, and quiet humiliation. Blind man's bluff. This involved blindfolding a player who then had to catch someone else. The problem was that Victorian households were full of precarious furniture and decorative porcelain. More than one family lost a vase, a teacup, or an entire table leg to this simple game. Snapdragon. This involved raisins, brandy, a large dish, and setting everything on fire. Players grabbed the flaming raisins with their fingers or teeth, because nothing says Merry Christmas like minor burns. Victorians called this fun. Modern parents would call this an insurance liability. Seasonal melancholy, a silent Victorian companion. We don't often think about this, but many Victorians got a little sad during Christmas. Nothing dramatic, just a soft melancholy baked into winter life. Cold rooms, early sunsets, lost family members, and the quiet pressure to be festive created a muted emotional undertow. You'll see entries like, "Mother wept briefly during the hymn. We assumed it was seasonal." Or, "Father retired early. The draft in the room seemed to trouble him." It wasn't depression in the modern sense. It was more like an annual emotional sigh, accepted, unremarked upon, and gently woven into the season. Social visits, a polite marathon. Victorians spent a lot of time visiting relatives and neighbors during Christmas week. This was exhausting. Not dramatically exhausting, just inconvenient. Visit types included a short call where you sit for 12 minutes and compliment the wallpaper, a longer call where you drink weak tea and pretend to enjoy a fruitcake no one has liked since 1843, or a duty visit to an elderly relative who insists you take home something strange, like an embroidered foot warmer. These visits were ritualistic, predictable, stiff, and mildly draining. People complained about them constantly, usually in the most polite phrasing possible. "We endured the Hodges for an hour longer than anticipated." Endured. Such a beautifully restrained Victorian word. The children's overexcitement problem. Children, of course, were thrilled by Christmas. A bit too thrilled. Victorian letters often mention kids not sleeping, kids waking adults before sunrise, kids overeating sweets, kids tripping over their own new toys, or kids screaming because the cracker toy wasn't loud enough. Yet Victorian parents expected composure. So naturally, the season included endless whispered reminders like, "Darling, do refrain from being spirited," which is Victorian for, "Stop that immediately."
Servants, the quiet backbone. Despite the mess, the chaos, and the eccentricities, Christmas couldn't function without servants. They experienced longer work hours, extra cooking duties, formal events to assist with, and a level of polite chaos that would exhaust any normal person. But they also received Boxing Day gifts, bonuses, sometimes, a half-day off, and a place in the broader ritual of Christmas. Their diaries reveal the true atmosphere of the season, calm on the surface, frantic beneath, but always steady, always polite, always quiet. Wrapping up this sleepy segment, Victorian Christmas was not glamorous or picture-perfect. It was full of tiny mishaps, polite disasters, and gentle emotional turbulence. Exactly the kind of little dramas that make history feel human. And the best part? Victorians rarely presented these issues as problems. They recorded them the way one notes the weather, lightly, calmly, and with the faintest hint of resignation. Because that was the Victorian way.
This part of the story is soft, calm, and almost meditative. It's the gentle fade-out of a season that, for Victorians, was as much about reflection as celebration. The day after Christmas. Boxing Day's gentle shift. The 26th of December was called Boxing Day, and it marked the moment when Victorian households finally exhaled. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was pleasantly inevitable. What actually happened on Boxing Day? Servants received small gifts or bonuses, often practical items like warm stockings, a tin of tea, or if the master was feeling particularly generous, a coin or two. Many took the afternoon off to visit family, though afternoon was sometimes generously interpreted as a sadly short window before returning for evening duties. Middle-class families used the day to recover from overeating and excessive polite conversation. Children played with their new toys until something broke, which usually took about 20 minutes. Fathers nursed headaches they politely pretended weren't from the punch bowl. It was essentially the Victorian equivalent of day after the holiday fatigue, but with more formality and significantly colder houses. The slow disappearance of decorations. Victorians didn't pack away their decorations right after Christmas. They eased into it, letting the holiday linger softly like a fading candle. How long decorations stayed up? Most families followed the tradition of keeping greenery up until Twelfth Night, which fell in early January. Removing it earlier was considered unlucky. Removing it later was also unlucky. Basically, if you didn't follow the timeline perfectly, the universe allegedly kept notes. So for nearly 2 weeks, homes stayed lightly festive. Dried-out holly leaves curled in corners, mistletoe sagged quietly from doorways. The Christmas tree drooped more each day, resigning itself to gravity. Candles shrank down to half their size, and the scent of pine faded into the more familiar scent of coal smoke and damp wool. There was no rush, just a slow, predictable retreat from celebration. The annual task of taking down the tree. Finally, when Twelfth Night arrived, families gathered to dismantle the tree. It was a solemn little ritual. Someone removed the top ornament, often an angel or star with mildly unsettling Victorian eyes. Children were asked to sit quietly and not touch the fragile glass baubles, which of course they tried to touch anyway. The candles were clipped off one by one, often revealing scorch marks from minor incidents no one wanted to discuss. The tree was dragged out of the house, leaving behind a trail of pine needles that would haunt carpets until spring. Servants usually completed the heavier work, but the emotional symbolism was shared by everyone. The holiday was officially over.
returning to Victorian routines. With the decorations gone, life snapped back, gently but firmly, to the routines that shaped the Victorian world. For households, ledgers reappeared, chores resumed, and attention shifted to the long stretch of winter still ahead. For children, holiday freedom ended, lessons resumed, and toy excitement faded into the background. For servants, the frantic holiday pace slowed to the usual relentless everyday demands. They didn't get downtime in a modern sense, just a slightly less frantic list of duties. For shopkeepers, the last of the holiday stock was cleared, windows were rearranged, and New Year goods began to appear, usually involving pens, diaries, and the promise of self-improvement. Victorians loved good resolution, especially ones they quietly abandoned by mid-January. A quiet winter afterglow. Even after the festivities faded, a soft afterglow lingered. This came from leftover sweets and puddings, half-burned candles reused for efficiency, drying greenery that somehow stayed up longer than anyone intended, and the faint memory of a house that had briefly felt warmer, busier, and more alive. Victorians weren't overly sentimental in public, but privately many recorded this after-feeling. The rooms feel emptier now. The fire seems quieter. The children speak less of gifts each day. It was not sadness, just the familiar return to silence. The softest holiday ritual? Remembering. In the days after Christmas, many Victorians wrote reflections in diaries, quietly noting relatives they saw, things they were grateful for, things they wished had gone better, and thoughts about the year ahead. It was peaceful, understated, and profoundly human. No declarations, no dramatic resolutions, just small, thoughtful musings, the kind you write when the world is cold and still, and there's nothing left to do but think. The final step, letting the season go. By early January, the holiday was officially receded into memory, and Victorians were fine with that. Christmas was meant to be temporary, a brief, warm pause in the middle of winter. Then life resumed, quietly, predictably, and with the comforting monotony the Victorians secretly loved. Work began again, school lessons resumed. Routine swallowed the glitter, the songs, and the food. The season was over, but the impression that left, those little pockets of warmth, light, and gentle eccentricity, lasted well into the long gray winter.